When you think of classic SpongeBob, you probably don't think about horror, right? After all, the show is far from a horror series, but honestly, some of the show's most classic episodes are kind of scary. In this video, I'm going to talk about classic SpongeBob's scariest moments and what made them so great. So consider this a warning. If you are a ScardeyPants, then this is not the video for you. Speaking of ScardeyPants, I think that episode is a great place to begin. Released on October 27th, 1999, episode 13A ScaryPants was the first Halloween-themed episode in SpongeBob history. Looking back on it, I really wish they made this episode a double-length special, but instead we got I Was a Teenage Gary as episode 13B, but we'll talk more about that one later. I don't think there are really any episodes of SpongeBob that fully fall under the horror category, and ScaryPants is no different. However, it all starts with the intro scene, with the French narrator introducing the setting as the camera pans to the Krusty Krab. Right away, we are hit with spooky vibes thanks to the music and sound design. This continues as we enter the Krusty Krab kitchen to see SpongeBob freaking out over the squeaky door. The way he rushes through the dishes so he can go home shows that he is spooked, and at least for me, that was enough to get me spooked as a kid. Anyways, the episode continues to be spooky when Mr. Krabs starts telling SpongeBob his ghost story about the Flying Dutchman. Granted, Eugene's story isn't really all that scary, but the way it is presented in the show gives the scene that eerie feeling. Part of this comes from the lighting and color palette in the scene, and the episode in general. The entire episode takes place at night, so everything is dark, especially at the Krusty Krab where all the lights are off throughout the episode, aside from that first scene in the kitchen. I think that darkness of the episode really adds to the scariness of it, especially for small children. I don't know about you guys, but I was quite scared of the dark throughout much of my childhood, so the fact that this episode takes place at night just kind of inherently adds to the scariness of it. This is a common theme in many of SpongeBob's scariest episodes. That being said, the thing that they really nailed in this episode, what really makes it spooky to me, is the music and sound design. If you are a fan of horror movies, you would know that music and sound in general can be used quite effectively to create a scary atmosphere. If we go back to the scene of SpongeBob in the kitchen at the Krusty Krab, we can see this in action. There's the squeakiness of the door, the sound of the wind, the soft, eerie music playing, and then the dramatic music that leads up to the tickets in the order window spelling boo. By the way, I'm not sure how much of this I can actually play for you guys, unfortunately, as it's really hard to use audio from the show without getting a copyright claim, so please bear with me if the clips I use with audio are quite limited. Anyways, this trend continues in the scene where SpongeBob is walking home from the Krusty Krab. The music in this scene builds tension as it starts off rather quiet but moody, with scary sound effects such as weird laughter really putting us on the edge of our seats. This scene comes to a climax when Mrs. Puff scares SpongeBob, accompanied by a sudden dramatic change in the volume of the music.
Happy Halloween, ScardeyPants!
But ScaryPants is far from the only SpongeBob episode that uses music to create a scary mood. Perhaps the most famous example I can think of that does this is the episode Clams. In this one, we hear this reoccurring theme that plays whenever the giant clam is about to show up. When we hear this music,
Hurry, SpongeBob! The music's getting faster!
we know something bad is about to happen. The show even breaks the fourth wall in this episode as Mr. Krabs explains what they are doing by saying every sailor knows they're in trouble when they hear music in D minor, even showing us an actual orchestra playing the tune used in the episode. D minor is a common key that is used in horror movies, but I'm not really a music theory expert or anything, so I'll just leave it at that. The important thing to know is that the music in the episode makes it feel scary. A couple of days ago, I ran a poll asking you guys which classic SpongeBob episode was the scariest, and unfortunately, I can only put 4 options, but of the ones I listed, over 50% of you guys picked Rock Bottom, and I agree that this episode is kind of scary. This is one that genuinely scared me as a kid. I think part of what made this episode scary to me was just the idea of getting lost in a remote area by yourself at night. Like ScardeyPants, this episode makes use of nighttime as a way to create a spooky, scary mood. Although, technically, it's not really nighttime, it's just so deep that light from the sun doesn't reach this part of the ocean, but the effect is the same. Like Clams and ScaryPants, this episode also makes use of scary music to create fear and tension. This happens in the scene at the bus station when SpongeBob's flashlight goes out and continues as he tries to run away from the anglerfish that gives him his balloon back. Unlike those other episodes though, this one also makes use of character design to add to the spookiness. I like how this shows off Stephen Hillenburg's marine biology background, as a lot of deep-sea fish really do just happen to look kinda creepy, like some of the background characters we see at the bus station and in the scene with the bathrooms. So not only does this add to the scariness, but it's also accurate to real life. Now it's time to start getting into the extra scary classic SpongeBob episodes, starting with SB129. This one was probably the episode that freaked me out the most as a kid, but I could never really quite figure out why, to be honest. And I also thought that I was alone in that opinion, so I was a little surprised when I saw that a lot of you guys agreed with me. In hindsight, I think what scared me the most about this episode was the scene where Squidward enters the time machine and ends up nowhere. All the voices repeating, "Alone, alone, alone," always kind of creeped me out. And watching as panic started to set in for Squidward gave me an uneasy feeling, especially the first time I watched it, as I didn't know how he was going to get out of that bizarre situation. And then the scene where Squidward ends up in prehistoric Bikini Bottom is also kind of scary. The music in this part of the episode sets an eerie mood, especially right after Squidward exits the time machine. And like Rock Bottom, the character designs for SpongeBob and Patrick are kind of scary too. We see prehistoric versions of them in SpongeBob BC, but in that episode, the characters clearly still have similar personalities to the versions of them that we see in the rest of the show. In SB129 though, that doesn't really seem to be the case, as they behave more like wild animals. When they start chasing Squidward for playing his clarinet, they seem to have violent intentions on their minds, which freaked me out as a kid. At this point, I still haven't talked about the absolute scariest episode of classic SpongeBob, but don't worry, I'll get to that soon. First though, I want to talk about the episode that I already referenced, I Was a Teenage Gary. As I said at the beginning of the video, this is the sister episode to ScaryPants. While I don't think this episode is nearly as scary, it is a good fit to go alongside a Halloween-themed episode, as the ending is pretty creepy. The way SpongeBob and Squidward turn into snails really freaked me out as a kid. Not so much Squidward, because they don't actually show us that happening to him, but the scene where SpongeBob slowly transforms into a snail after getting injected with snail plasma is pretty scary. Honestly, that scene kinda creeps me out even today. Although, I do think it's really funny how he starts walking really slow right before he fully turns into a snail. But alright, that's enough teasing. Now I'll get to the point with the episode that I think is the scariest. Of course, I'm talking about Graveyard Shift. I actually didn't include this episode on the poll I made a few days ago, which was a pretty big oversight on my part. If I had to guess, if I did include it, it probably would have gotten the most votes, or at least would have come close to beating SB129. Like ScaryPants and Rock Bottom, this episode takes place at night, which, of course it does. The episode is literally called Graveyard Shift. And I mean, with a name like that, it stands to reason that it's gonna be a spooky episode. Like some of the other episodes I've already mentioned, music plays a big role in the spooky feeling this episode has. And that starts right off the bat during the title card sequence. I can only play a few seconds, but just listen to this. When you hear music like that before the episode has even started, it feels like a bit of a warning. What makes this even more effective, though, is the fact that the episode opens with very calm music and narration from the French narrator, subverting our expectations, and perhaps luring many into a false sense of security. A couple of minutes later, though, we get our first spooky sequence of the episode when SpongeBob has to take out the trash. Once again, the music suddenly shifts, creating tension as SpongeBob becomes nervous about having to make the short walk to the dumpster. At night. And of course, he freaks out as he's taking the trash out, just how I used to freak out when I would have to take the trash out the night before the garbage truck came. Only I lived in a very quiet suburban neighborhood and didn't really have anything to fear. I'm just a bit of a weenie. Also, can I just point out that the flower clouds are all squiggly in this episode, and they're all the same color, which kind of adds to the spooky atmosphere? It's a very subtle touch, but one that I think is also used in other episodes. Anyways, this scene is immediately followed up with Squidward telling SpongeBob the story of the hash-slinging slasher, which really ramps up the fear factor. He does admit that it was all a lie when SpongeBob starts freaking out, which resolves that tension in the short term, but it comes back at the end of the episode. First, Squidward starts to freak out when he hears SpongeBob mopping the ceiling, but he can't tell what's going on. Granted, that's a pretty unexpected thing to do, so he is rightfully startled when SpongeBob pops up next to him from above. But where things get really scary is in the climax of the episode. The thing that Squidward said would happen in his story about the hash-slinging slasher starts to actually happen, leading us to believe that it might actually be a real story. What makes this scene even scarier is the fact that Squidward is the one who starts freaking out despite the fact that he knew the story wasn't real, which again kind of opens the door to the possibility that perhaps something more sinister is happening. Of course, it turns out that it was just some guy trying to apply for a job, and it was just Nosferatu messing with the lights, but they never explained how Richard got a bus to the Krusty Krab late at night, so I guess that one will just remain a mystery. Finally, I want to talk about a couple of random moments from other episodes that really freaked me out as a kid. The first of these comes from the episode Shanghaied. Despite the fact that this episode features the Flying Dutchman, a literal ghost pirate, it isn't really that scary. In fact, it's a really funny episode. But the scene where Squidward gets thrown into this pocket dimension, or whatever it is, always freaked me out pretty majorly. Another episode that always got me was Wormy. While most of the episode is just fine, I was always creeped out every time they cut to a close-up of a fly. In fact, I would close my eyes right before those cuts came up so I didn't have to see it. But the noise, too, also was part of that, and I couldn't really avoid that. Anyways, what SpongeBob moments do you think were the scariest? Were you also freaked out by some of these episodes? If you liked this video, please do give it a like. That would really help me out. If you really liked it and you would like to see why I think Squidward is a better friend to SpongeBob than Patrick, I'll put that video on screen now for you to watch next. Anyways, that's all for this one. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. And as always, never forget to be yourself.